Welcome to Alumni Extras. This is a new format of conversations where we continue a discussion already started through other initiatives in the alumni program. This might have been through a webinar, a workshop, an alumni blog, or a Remarkable Alumni podcast. The first Alumni Extra follows on from the recent Adaptation to Climate Change webinar presented by Dr. Joanne Nyland. Those of you who joined us for that webinar or who have watched the recording might recall that there were a number of questions we were unable to answer within the webinar timeframe. And so today we have a chance to discuss Johanna's thoughts on some of those. So thank you, Johanna, for joining us again to continue this discussion.
Yeah, great to be here.
And thank you also to those people who posed those questions during the webinar. When we looked at the questions, we were able to group them into themes for today's discussion. So let's start with the really big one. Johanna, should we be resigned to climate change, even catastrophic climate change, and adapt to that rather than focusing on mitigation through major changes such as disestablishing fossil fuel economies and shifting to sustainable economies?
Look, thanks, Joanne. Look, I think there's a misconception. That's one of the major misconceptions that we have looked at through research as well, is that it's either or. So we either adapt to climate change or we reduce greenhouse gas, so we do mitigation. And those two actually go really hand in hand. And so I think we need to think about in the broader framework of sustainability. So how can we secure that our communities and our societies are livable, but we are also caring for the environment at the same time? And so any action that we need to take would be to look into how we can reduce the use of fossil fuels and, really move towards more sustainable societies. I mean, there is already locked in climate change and climate change impacts, and for many people, even that thought is pretty scary. But we are already living in a changing climate. So I think any actions that we take will need to really, make us more adaptable, make our systems and our infrastructure, but also, the way that we live our lives much more adaptable. And part of that is, is mitigation and adaptation as well.
So bearing in mind those two things working hand in hand, what do you see as the distinct differences between mitigation and adaptability?
Well, mitigation is about reducing greenhouse gases. So it is about finding, investing more in renewable energy options that don't increase emissions. And a lot of the work that's being done there is, at the government level, well, really businesses as well, but it is really about community members as well. So trying to switch to more sustainable transport, for instance, so more walking, cycling, using public transport or not having to drive. So trying to, for instance, buy more locally where it is maybe a walking distance, or, what we've seen as well is that during COVID in particular, there has been stronger linkages created with new businesses, for instance, going up to rural farms and sourcing produce from there and then connecting people in the city with that so people don't have to drive, but there's also, benefits, more direct benefits for farmers. So it is that looking at innovation as well. And for adaptation, it is really any actions that you can take in order to make sure that you can live in a changing climate. And I think some of the other questions related to, for instance, what can individuals do? So, understanding the risks and the changing climatic factors where you live. So whether, there is an increasing trend, for instance, in extreme events or heavy rainfall, what do you need to do about your insurance if there's in your location, if there starts to be more heat waves? So how do you actually cope with that? Do you have a good awareness of that? And, what is your heat wave plan? The same goes with the bushfires.
And I think that leads nicely into the next comment, because obviously there's quite a lot of things in there that people would need to be thinking about doing. And one of your papers about transformative adaptation talked about some of the challenges of practice over theory, and also about the importance of making quite big steps. But some people, especially some individuals and small businesses with kind of many competing priorities, might be a little bit overwhelmed with information and feel that the changes are too big or too much for them to be able to cope with. how do we handle that? And would you say that it's better to keep a simple solution in this situation, or do we aim high and work out how to get past those concerns?
I think the popular answer from a scientist is that you need to do both. So, but look at, for instance, COVID. So a lot of the things that we said, and the things that we haven't even thought about for businesses in particular, is that, a lot of the change is incremental. So understanding kind of the changing trends and really keeping an eye out what is happening in the environment, but what is also happening in society. And we have seen with COVID that businesses can pivot very quickly. Governments can pivot quickly. And there is a kind of an increased opportunity to make these more transformative changes now, that people are understanding how, for instance, our food systems, how the supply chains are very vulnerable. So what can individuals actually do, and what can businesses do in that sense? But it is more kind of trying to marry the incremental actions, but also thinking about the long term, and that's super hard in terms of most of us don't. Somebody said that in 2015, not one person got the answer right to the question, where do you see yourself in 2020? We did not see us being in lockdown or, having this kind of global crisis. I think those who have been researching pandemics have been warning us for years now that this is possible because of the way that we are globally now interconnected. But I think right now, I think what businesses do need to think is to make contingency planning. So thinking about we've had a massive disruption. So what can we now do to do differently? Whether and we've seen, for instance, some of the companies, for instance, down in Melbourne, they've even nightclubs have they wanted to retain staff. So they switched to delivering health products and cleaning products to communities. And so they could actually keep their operations going, even if it wasn't what they had been initially set up to do. So I think right now it's a key kind of moment to think about innovation, but also think about, if in the future similar things would happen again, how can we be better prepared?
And you've mentioned COVID there and adaptation to that a couple of times. And adaptations, is one thing that we need to do. But the actual mechanism for changing really old habits is much harder until we're kind of hit in the face with an issue. And COVID's certainly done that for us. I guess the next step from that then is, how do we keep that momentum going so that we don't all rush back to what was, our default positions, or what we might call the new normal? I'm not necessarily sure that a new normal is what we need either. It's that adaptability to keep going. How do we keep that momentum so we don't go back too far?
I mean, behavioral change is really, really difficult. I mean, we see that in our own children, we see that in ourselves as well. But I think it is, for change behavior, it is about changing our mindset as well. And change is really hard, and most of us don't actually like change. But the reality is that we are in a changing climate, and we are in a society that is so globally now connected. I think the opportunity right now is to look at those kind of positive lessons, also realizing that we are much more adaptable and resilient than we thought we were. And, really looking at the habits and the kind of mindset that has helped us for most of us to get us through this crisis, and thinking about what are the kind of opportunities also in the future. But behavioral change is hard, and we've seen that with climate change, because a lot of the times we think about climate change as something that's going to happen to somebody else somewhere else, or it's going to happen in 30 years time and I'll be fine because I won't necessarily be here anymore. So these are a lot of the kinds of discussions that communities are having. But having seen now with COVID, but also with the last summer in Australia, I think we can quite confidently saying that there are the underlying trends. And if we don't understand what is changing and how that's changing, it's very difficult to, even plan for the future. So realizing and understanding that, this is not necessarily new normal, because a lot of the discussions we have about new normal is thinking, okay, we go to the next stage. So this is the new normal and this is where we are planning. Whereas I think with climate and just with how things are changing globally, I don't know if there is a new normal. I think that, well, if there is a new normal, it is a process of continuous change, really.
Yeah, and I think that they're really good points. The whole not in my backyard, it's not going to happen to me. Climate change is something a long time in the future. And we've seen, as you mentioned, some really strong examples of the impacts of it with the bushfires and to some extent the interconnectedness of the world in terms of COVID. And I think what we've seen in all of that is the really strong role that governments have played, both in providing information, but also in terms of the management and control systems that have been put in place. And we see that in Melbourne now with the mandated wearing of masks and all of those kind of things. If governments have roles to play in providing information on current and future climate hazards, what do you think is the kind of information that should be provided, and how can it be presented in a way that everybody will understand it's real, it's now, and will be able to respond to that?
I mean, these are some of the really, really tough questions because it is about information, and people have so we've done some research looking at, for instance, in tourism sector in Fiji, how the managers and directors, access information, what kind of information, and how, what is their capacity, or we call it the information literacy, even to process, information about weather. And we find that that's really varied. But in terms of the information, I know that there's a lot of fear. For instance, looking at the future trends, especially regarding sea level rise on the coastal areas. And how do you then communicate that information to communities so that they don't freak out? But I think part of the conversation needs to be that the changes are under the way, rather than discussing it as a panic scenario. It is more about the community. What are the community values and aspirations as well, because that will also direct the investments that governments can do, especially in the coastal areas. So, and, one of the key things is to start the conversations early, and then also track change. And we are not very good at doing that. But tracking change in terms of, and I mean, insurance companies is really a key example, that they have their thresholds. So they will give insurance to a point. So if your basement gets flooded once a year, you're likely to get covered that through your insurance. If that happens 4 times a year, then there's really, that triggers a different process. And in some cases, we were already seeing that in the eastern coast of the United States, it is not possible to have insurance anymore, to live in those areas that are highly hazard prone and where they have clearly seen an increase in extreme weather trends.
And possibly on the New South Wales coast with the erosion that was happening in the last week. I can't imagine those houses are going to do very well with insurance in the next few years either. I guess sticking with that kind of policy and government area, we've seen through COVID kind of a reorganisation of Australian government structures with the new kind of national cabinet type approaches. Is there an opportunity for us to start to rethink the strategy coordination between federal, state and local governments, and perhaps a more holistic approach rather than what often happens is that combative approach between federal, state and local? Is that perhaps something we should be looking at too?
Absolutely. Look, I think what we can see, there's positive and negative lessons coming obviously out of COVID. So some people seem to think that, the state leadership is what is actually, has made a difference in how Australia has responded. But I think there are increasingly opportunities for much more collaborative relationships between the levels of government, but also, how they all interact with communities. And one of the pieces that I wrote for Lowy Institute last year was looking at adaptation as a national priority for Australia. And there I suggested, for instance, that, a much closer collaboration of all levels of government, especially because the Paris Agreement that Australia has signed in 2015 commits all the countries to have a national adaptation plan, and then also tracking progress, every 5 years, how they're going. And after the fires in Australia, we had a massive discussions about adaptation and resilience. And some of the issues that, for instance, firefighters have been reporting from the front is that they have never seen this kind of behavior of fires, and they don't have experience how to deal with fire tornadoes. So this is a shared discussion that really needs to include, all the community groups, and we have lots of volunteers, especially in the fire service sector, but also all the levels of government coming together and putting short-term plans, but also looking at the long term. And I think in that discussion, and as we've seen with COVID, science will have and will play an increasingly important role.
And I suppose climate change, bushfires, they don't respect administrative boundaries. So a fire in New South Wales isn't going to stop because it got to the New South Wales Queensland border, and so that collaborative approach is obviously going to be really important. But then obviously a local response too in areas of real concentrated need. The other part of this, of course, is the traditional custodians in Australia who have been part of the land for thousands of years and have a really good understanding of that. And we saw some of that again with the bushfires, where the traditional custodians were talking about traditional fire management practices that they've been using for millennia to work with the Australian landscape. How do you think we get people like universities, councils and governments to engage more with the traditional custodians, management groups to address the impacts of climate change in Australia in particular?
Look, I think that's one of the key issues for Australia. Obviously, that's kind of mixed in the history of the country as well. But there's so much untapped knowledge, within Indigenous communities, and that knowledge will definitely play a key role. I think at the moment we are not great at understanding it or harnessing it. But for instance, a lot of the universities are forging new collaborations with Indigenous communities. And I was recently on a research program or call where we had Indigenous groups, representatives from the beginning. Because I think often, especially with research, we have these ideas or there's a call for tender, and then academics kind of get together and in the end they say, okay, well, we've now got this project, now we're going to go and consult Indigenous communities. I think one of the key issues is to have them have those conversations and create those relationships as well. And understand that, especially the research we've done in the Pacific Islands and in New Zealand as well, has shown that Indigenous knowledge it's not just a set of knowledge, it's a way of living, it's a way of being. And so it is very different from Western knowledge. And so, but I think we definitely need a much deeper appreciation what that means and what we can also learn from that.
And bringing that in early in the conversation, as you said, just rather than at the last minute or later in the conversation. So the other, big part of the questions that people had for us were around industry and food production, because obviously they're both areas that are quite impactful on the environment. Is there a particular kind of industry or sector that can act as a roadmap for action in terms of adaptation? The energy sector perhaps seems a good place to start because it has a strong growth in aspects such as renewable energy and energy efficiency, but we're not far enough down the path with that yet. And energy obviously has a huge role in all of the other industries such as transport, manufacturing and things like that, which can be affected. So do you think an energy industry is a good place for us to start, or do we need to look at a more holistic approach to industry?
Look, I think we need we need a holistic approach, but energy sector is definitely one of the big ones that we need to start. I think what organisations like the Climate Council have already demonstrated for Australia and the Australia Institute as well, and they're very vocal about this, is that green technologies and that energy, that sector, can create many more jobs than mining ever will be able to do. And so I think the technology is already there. So we've had this discussion for years now, and it is possible. And what is encouraging about COVID is that it has shown that if we need to pivot quickly, we can do that. And so the same applies for energy. The solution's already there. So it is more about the will of governments and the private sector to invest in those technologies and actually allow innovation. I think for, for households, for communities, whatever solution you're proposing has to be easy to access that. Because we've seen from the behavioral science is that if a choice is easy, people will make that and it will become habit. So you change behavior. But if it's really difficult, for instance, to get information on solar energy or panels, or, it's difficult to find providers, difficult to understand how to use them, a lot of that puts barriers, especially at the household and community level, and even within industries. So I think the more that we can invest in innovation, but also making it easy to access, I think that's one of the major keys. And also how are we supporting renewable energy sector, for instance, in Australia, compared to how we are supporting the mining sector. But also looking at, so globally we talk about the just transition. So how can we, so we have lots of people working in these fossil fuel industries. How can we help them to transition? And especially communities. So there are specific communities in Australia that have, the mining is what keeps that town alive. So how can we help those communities to do that transition? I think that's it.
Yeah, no, and the other sector, I suppose, that has a big impact on the environment, and I think particularly in terms of the UN's conversations, is the livestock production industry. And I think one of the questions noted that the UN labelled meat as the world's most urgent problem and has been advocating for a shift to a plant-based diet. And there are two things to that. One is why are we not doing it? And the other is how do we ensure that the agricultural sector can transition effectively to deal with the pressures associated with climate change, but also to still be viable, because it is an industry that's under a great pressure already.
Look, both of those aspects are really, really important. In terms of how do we, shift towards more plant-based diets. So I think it's more about having it becoming, the new normal. So a lot of the cultures, in many of the cultures in Europe, Australia, USA, meat has always played a very significant part. But it is also having more availability of plant-based options, but also looking at the carbon print of what you're buying. But for instance, on the Gold Coast, I recently, or before COVID, I went to a restaurant that was all vegan. So you could order anything you liked. So let's say chicken or, all these kind of normal things that you would order at the restaurant. The difference was that it wasn't like, it was actually everything was plant-based and the food was amazing. And so I've been raving about that restaurant, but it is about having those options available, but also, helping the kind of shift and also having more conversations about, for instance, about the kind of carbon footprint of the food that we eat.
I might need the address of that restaurant later.
Yeah. In terms of how do you pivot the industry, I think it's also about looking for different options. So right now it seems that there's a lot of discussion that it's either or. So you either, you have cows, have a big farm and you focus on meat production. But I know some farms where they've actually started mixing, so they might reduce the, number of kind of the meat production, and they're starting to focus on, for instance, growing those plants or, looking at different options, how they can diversify their income as well. Because the whole question for the agriculture sector, it is some profit, but it's also about people's livelihoods. Yeah. And it's not just large-scale farms. I mean, we have, smallholder farmers as well, who are very, very dependent on the stock that they have. So it is more about, I think, in the agriculture sector, it is looking at increasing the diversity of options. So what are they actually growing? Where is that produce going as well? But it is, like you said, it is much like we need a holistic approach.
Absolutely. And I think one of the suggestions was that there might be an opportunity at the moment as we all move from COVID into whatever comes next. I'm not quite sure we know what that is yet. But whether there's an opportunity to combine action on climate change and the need to stimulate the economy in the post kind of COVID world, and what the government could or should be thinking about in that because at the moment most of the recovery strategy seems to be around the construction and manufacturing sector, but maybe there's an opportunity to look at climate as part of that.
No, look, absolutely. And we are seeing some countries and some cities to actually do that. So yesterday, the European Union approved their coronavirus package. And there's a really big chunk of that money going into climate action. So going into green recovery. We see cities like Amsterdam. So Amsterdam pretty much has paused, and said, in the wake of what we've just seen, we need to be more sustainable so that we have, better environmental outcomes, but also we can increase the health and well-being of people who make this city. And they're actually looking at the donut economics model and how to scale that down into a much more sustainable city. And so the opportunities for kind of rethinking and rebuilding are here. But I think a lot of the previous kind of baggage from what our normal was, is that people kept saying, well, we can't make these big changes because the communities won't do it and we're not going to get enough votes. Right now, we are in a position, really, globally, to make better decisions. And I think it will be a wasted opportunity if we don't integrate climate action. And a lot of governments are already doing that.
We've covered most of the questions that were left over from the webinar. I really enjoyed that conversation, so thank you for joining us again, Johana, and I really hope that we continue this conversation for a long time to come, because there's still a long way to go. But there is, hopefully with researchers and advocates such as yourself working to bring about change, it certainly provides us with a significant level of hope for the future. So thank you for joining us for this Alumni Extras conversation, and we look forward to bringing more great content to our alumni community soon.
Thanks, Joanne. And I just wanted to say that I'm happy if you have any questions that I did not answer or did not answer well enough. I'm more than happy if people want to reach out to me via LinkedIn or email.
Yep, great. Fantastic. Thank you so much.